full room. Can't let anybody else in at this point. So first of all, ladies and gentlemen and witnesses and distinguished guests, we'll call the hearing to order. And this hearing is entitled Challenges and Opportunities, the Advancement of Human Rights in India. And it will be comprised of two panels. Panel one, Mr. John Sifton, Mr. Ajit Sahi, and Mr. T. Kumar. Panel two, Mr. Jeff King, Mr. Musaddiq Thangi, Mr. Martina Vandenberg, and Mr. Raj Chairkhanda. I'll introduce them after the opening statements. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, the relationship between the United States and India is expanding rapidly. Last year, bilateral trade in goods and services was valued at over $100 billion, and the signing of the 2005 an expanded defense agreement paved the way for increasingly robust security ties. Since 2009, an annual strategic dialogue has strengthened these ties further, and the attendance of tens of thousands of bright, hardworking Indian students as U.S. universities have brought our two cultures ever closer together. Yet many of these new developments, while certainly positive, have overlooked a troubling array of human rights concerns that should give us pause. 2014, I chaired a hearing by this commission examining the plight of religious minorities in India, noting at the time an alarming trend in instances of communal violence targeting Christians and Muslims. By nearly all accounts, the number of these instances has grown in recent years. According to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's most recent report, quote, religious tolerance deteriorated and religious freedom violations increased in India, end quote, in 2015. The U.S. State Department's most recent International Religious Freedom report also cites several concerns, including the enforcement of anti-conversion laws in 6 states. Those convicted of violating these laws may face fines and in some cases up to 3 years in prison. On February 25th, the co-chairs of this commission and 32 of our colleagues, including 8 U.S. senators, wrote to the Prime Minister to express our concern at reports of violent incidents targeting religious minorities. The letter never received a formal reply, and the government's public comment on it characterized the concerns of these members of Congress as constituting a, quote, aberration, close quote. Throughout the fall of 2015, numerous well-known Indian writers, artists, and scientists returned national awards in protest at what they perceived as growing intolerance against religious minorities and free expression. Some Indian business leaders and a noted Indian-born economist echoed these concerns, pointing out that a growth in intolerance could hurt foreign investment. I'm going to abbreviate my statement somewhat. We'll include the entire statement in the record. The introduction last week of India's first ever comprehensive anti-human trafficking law is a welcome addition to efforts at countering this insidious blight on society. Unfortunately, while some efforts are being made in the right direction, many are not. International and domestic NGOs, including a considerable number that support human rights initiatives or marginalized communities, have been targeted by the government. According to various sources, licenses for nearly 9,000 NGOs receiving foreign funding were canceled by the BJP in 2015, and several high-profile Western-based organizations, including Greenpeace and the Ford Foundation, were denied access to funds. This state of affairs is gravely concerning. I must commend my colleagues in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, including Chairman Corker and Ranking Member Cardin, for recently voicing their concerns on many of these same issues. It's my sincere hope that this hearing will shed greater light on these concerns. I look forward to exploring ways we can work together to confront these challenges and advance human rights in India. And with that, I now recognize my distinguished co-chair, Congressman McGovern, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. And I'm happy to join with my distinguished colleague and the co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Representative Pitts, in welcoming all of you today to this hearing on the challenges and opportunities in the advancement of human rights in India. You know, India is the world's largest democracy and a strategic partner of the United States. Tomorrow we will welcome Prime Minister Modi as he addresses a joint session of Congress, an occasion that will surely inspire pride among the 3 million Indian Americans who live here in the United States. The promotion of human rights is a core value of U.S. foreign policy, and as U.S.-Indian ties strengthen and our partnership deepens, our two democracies must continue to engage on issues of accountability, rule of law, and human rights. Our purpose today is to learn about the human rights challenges and opportunities in India, and to ask how U.S. policymakers can support India in complying with its human rights obligations. India is an ethnically, culturally, and religiously diverse country that holds 1/6 of the world's population. No one should be surprised that political, religious, and communal tensions can sometimes arise. Fortunately, India's constitution provides important human rights protections. Unfortunately, as happens in many countries, there is a gap between the promise of the Constitution and other laws and the practice on the ground. For example, let's look at religious freedom. India is officially secular with a long history of religious tolerance. The Constitution says that all people are entitled to freedom of conscience and have the right to profess, practice, and propagate religion. India's federal law provides minority community status for 5 religious groups: Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, Parsis, and Sikhs. But in spite of these constitutional protections, religious minority communities, including Sikhs, have experienced harassment and violence, often at the hands of Hindu nationalist groups, while impunity for the perpetrators of the violence persists. State-level anti-conversion laws allow government officials to decide whether conversions from Hinduism are illegal, but choosing a religion is a private act that should not be subject to government regulation. In addition, last March, the Indian government failed to issue visas for a delegation from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. None of this bodes well, quite frankly. The Indian Constitution also provides for freedom of speech and expression, yet just last month a new Human Rights Watch report detailed the ways in which overly broad laws, including sedition and defamation laws that date from the colonial era, are being used as political tools to silence and harass critics. This would appear to go hand in hand with the Indian authorities' recent crackdown on civil society, restrictions placed on NGOs that receive foreign funding, and burdensome regulation of NGOs that are critical of government authorities, threaten to silence civil society voices. One reason this trend attracts attention here is that the United States is the top source of foreign donations to Indian NGOs, providing more than 3 times as much as the next largest donor. Even though the Constitution prohibited caste discrimination in 1949, we will also hear today about the persistence of caste-based discrimination, which affects millions of people, and the increased vulnerability of the scheduled caste to violence, sex and labor trafficking, and debt bondage. We will hear that crimes against women are unfortunately common, including kidnapping, rape, domestic violence, and dowry deaths, and that Dalit and tribal women are especially vulnerable. One additional issue that I would like to highlight today is the fundamental obligation of the Indian authorities to take into account the human rights of people affected by major development projects in the country. In one well-known case, that of the Sardar Sarovar Dam on the Narmada River, communities have been fighting for more than 30 years to keep from being uprooted or to be appropriately compensated for the damage that has already been done. Forced displacement due to large-scale development projects is also a human rights violation. The human rights challenges India faces are not insurmountable, but in order to overcome them, authorities will need to fulfill the promise of India's own constitution, by continuing to consolidate democratic practices, enforcing laws, and sanctioning and punishing the use of violence. In India, as in the United States and other countries around the world, impunity facilitates the persistence of human rights violations. Let me just close by sharing a message from Representative Zoe Lofgren, who is on her way back to Washington from California this afternoon, but will not arrive in time to join us. She welcomes this hearing, and if she were here, she would speak out against the practice of forced conversion of non-Hindus and the lack of recognition of Sikhism as a fully separate religion. I ask to enter into the record two documents, a letter from the South Asia Human Rights Documentation Center dated June 2, 2016, and the November 2015 Independent People's Tribunal report on Sardar Sarovar claims and the realities of development and rehabilitation.
Without objection,
I thank
so
you,
ordered.
Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Chair thanks the distinguished gentleman, and now is pleased to recognize another human rights champion in Congress, a gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Trent Franks, a commissioner, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the first thing I would say is that I am grateful to you and to Mr. McGovern and others for holding this hearing at such an important juncture in U.S.-India relations. I had the privilege, Mr. Chairman, as you know, of a trip to India with you, where we were able to see many things together, and I know that it is perfunctory in gatherings like this to esteem the chairman his due honor, but the truth is that no one in Congress has been a greater champion for the downtrodden, for religious freedom, for those who cannot defend themselves, for human rights, than one Chairman Joseph Pitts. And it has been my precious honor to serve with him a long time now, and I'm grateful to be invited to this hearing and again express my heartfelt gratitude for who he is and what he has done here in Congress. Mr. Chairman, as we all know, India is the world's most populous democracy and the world's third largest economy. And it is my heartfelt conviction that as the partnership between the United States and India grows, due attention to the fundamental human right of religious freedom, respect for the human dignity regardless of religion, class, or caste, and consideration of every human right for all people is of the utmost importance. I'm privileged to serve as co-chair of the International Religious Freedom Caucus, of which Congressman Pitts and Congressman McGovern are members. And my office is continually working with religious communities in India and has done so for many years. Religious minority communities, including Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and Sikhs, have endured ongoing violence and harassment for decades in India, and continue to live in a climate where known perpetrators commit violence with impunity. During anti-Muslim riots in Gujarat in 2002, as many as 2,000 Muslims, including women and children, were killed. More than 100,000 people were forced from their homes. I had the opportunity to travel, as I've said, to Gujarat with some of my colleagues, again, including Chairman Joseph Pitts, following these reprehensible acts of violence. It was an honor to meet with community leaders from all faiths, to hear their stories, and to support them in their efforts to build unity and stop the violent attacks from extremists that all communities suffered under. In 2007 and 2008, similar attacks against Christians in Odisha left nearly 40 people dead. Churches and homes were destroyed, and nearly 10,000 people were displaced. More recently, in 2013, violence by Hindu extremists against Muslims in Uttar Pradesh resulted in nearly 40 deaths. At least a dozen women and girls were raped, and more than 50,000 people were displaced. Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and other religious minority communities continue to experience incidents of discrimination, intimidation, harassment, and violent attacks. Unfortunately, because of the country's current climate of impunity with regard to such attacks, many victims may never receive justice. Human rights groups in India have reported extensively on incidents of discrimination, intimidation, harassment, and violence against these communities. And I am thankful that groups like those represented on our distinguished panel today continue to document and report on this issue. It's my sincerest hope, Mr. Chairman, that as our nation's relationship with India continues to develop, respect for the fundamental human right of religious freedom will be realized for these innocent people who have endured such violence for so many years. And I sincerely thank the panelists for their continued commitment to work on human rights in India and across the world, really. I look forward to hearing what you have to say today, and I am grateful for all of those in attendance, and may we all work to a day when every person will have the right to be free and to worship and to have the religious freedom that is the God-given gift of every human being. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. We'll now call the first panel to the witness table, and I'll introduce them in the order of their presentation as they come forward. First of all, Mr. John Sifton is the Asia Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch and works on South and Southeast Asia. Previously, he was the director of One World Research, a public interest research and investigation firm. Before joining One World Research, Sifton spent 6 years at Human Rights Watch, first as a researcher in the Asia Division, focusing on Afghanistan and Pakistan, then as the senior researcher on terrorism and counterterrorism. Secondly, we have Mr. Ajit Sahi. He is a human rights and civil liberties activist and journalist from India with 3 decades of experience. He has campaigned extensively against a deliberate targeting by Indian police of innocent citizens in fake terror cases, as well as for the rights of India's marginalized social minorities, including the low-caste Dalits and tribal people. And finally, Mr. T. Kumar is the Amnesty International USA's International Advocacy Director. He has served as a human rights monitor around the world and was the director of several refugee camps and refugee ships. He also served as a consultant to the Quaker United Nations office and was a professor at the Washington College of Law. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming today to share your expertise with us. Your written statements will be made a part of the record. Because of the length of this hearing, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes each, and then we'll do the questions and answers after that. And so at this point, the chair is pleased to recognize Mr. Sifton for his 5-minute summary of his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify. This is a well-timed hearing. I think it's fitting and proper to hold a hearing today to coincide with the eve of the arrival of the Prime Minister and on the eve of his historic address. Holding this hearing sends a very clear message that while the United States values its improving relationship with India, it is concerned with India's human rights record, and it should be. The Indian government, of course, has every right to raise its own concerns with the United States human rights record. And speaking as a representative of an international human rights organization that works on over 90 countries worldwide, including on the United States itself, we encourage Prime Minister Modi to do just that, raise human rights issues that the United States has. Excessive and abusive NSA surveillance practices, discriminatory and excessive use of lethal force in policing, whatever he wishes. But just as India should be raising its concerns with the United States, the U.S. has an important role to raise human rights issues in India. It's a false claim that some in India make that because India is a democracy and an ally, the United States has to remain silent about its record. Now, India has taken important strides in recent years, in particular with legal reform and with respect to the treatment of women, Dalits, and various vulnerable groups. There have been recent legislation in the areas of women's rights, LGBT rights, and the rights of disabled people and other vulnerable groups. But in many areas, the government and local authorities continue to fall short, both with respect to legal reforms and, more importantly, the implementation of legal reforms. Now, I've provided the committee with the written version of my testimony, which is now going live on Human Rights Watch's website. It focuses on several areas of concern. The main sections outline freedom of expression, which I believe all the members have alluded to already. The written submission discusses overly restrictive laws on sedition, criminal defamation, and other criminal provisions which can be and are used to stifle dissent. This is the Human Rights Watch report that was released the other week. It's called Stifling Dissent, and it outlines in terrible detail all of the cases over the last couple of years in which local and national government have used these laws to restrict journalists, cartoonists, and other members of civil society. So that's one issue I address in my written testimony. The second is restrictions on civil society. And I just want to bore down for a moment on this issue. The law that India has, the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, is the problem here. And it is a problematic law which U.S. lawmakers should raise with Indian government officials as much as they can. This law is the law that is used to make life difficult for nonprofits and other charities inside of India. And I'm glad, by the way, that Senator Cardin raised this when he was there recently. It's a very problematic law that needs to be repealed or reformed. Third, violence against religious minorities. The written submission details an alarming rise in incidents of violence and harassment of religious minorities, in particular Muslims, but also Christians. There are also problems with forced conversions of Sikhs and lack of accountability for violence against Sikhs, both 30 years ago, but also violence against Muslims as recently as this decade. I note in my testimony that the issue is not merely one to address to the Indian government, but also to the ruling BJP government. Prime Minister Modi, besides being the Prime Minister of India, is also the leader of his party, and his party is an actor when it comes to restraining violence against religious minorities, and I urge people to understand that distinction. I raise caste issues in my written submission, ongoing failures by the government to address long-standing inequalities and injustices. And my written submission also discusses continuing concerns with violence against women, the LGBT community, as well as issues related to the military's operations in emergency areas. Now, as the committee's aware, India, like the United States, is a federal structure. So it's a little bit complicated to raise these issues with the national government and the prime minister. But the central government has too often used this as an excuse for its own inaction in addressing human rights concerns and failed to use its power and influence to compel local jurisdictions to protect human rights. So I urge members of Congress to not let that federalism issue stop us from raising human rights issues directly with the national government. The Modi government has failed to promptly condemn attacks against religious minorities. It's failed to call on state governments to investigate and prosecute those responsible for religious violence, some of whom are members and supporters of the BJP. And similarly, while state governments have been responsible for using and misusing problematic national laws, the Modi government has a record of defending those laws like the sedition law and the criminal defamation law. So I urge you to raise these issues directly with the national government, even if it's a local issue. Okay, in conclusion, progress on human rights in India will continue to falter unless the Modi administration takes better steps to ensure justice and accountability for all of its citizens, protect vulnerable communities, protect the free exchange of ideas and dissent. The lack of effective implementation of laws remains the persistent challenge. Government officials are not held accountable. Impunity persists for police and security personnel who are shielded by laws. So we urge members of Congress to press with the Indian government, prioritize these vital issues and raise them directly in interactions in the months and years ahead, but in particular tomorrow. Thank you.
Chair thanks, gentlemen, and now recognizes Mr. Ajit Sahi. 5 minutes for your summary.
Honorable Chairman and Congressman Franks, thank you so much for inviting me here. I come from India, and as you've read my brief profile, much of the things that I have to say in my oral testimony, of course, has been covered by my co-panelist, Mr. Sifton. Two things are very important to know about the current status of human rights in India. One is, why is it happening? And two is, where do we see it going from here? The first part, Mr. Sifton, towards the end of his oral testimony, he hinted at it, and he said we should recognize that Mr. Modi's BJP party is an actor. I would like to make a small amendment to that, and I would say it is the director and not just the actor. It is the producer of human rights violations in India. It is the director of human rights violations in India because it springs from an organization which is fundamentally racist, human rights, an organization that has indulged in human rights abuses and violence for nearly 90 years. This is an organization which is known better by its acronym called RSS, which is a self-avowed, self-confessed Hindu supremacist organization. And the BJP is a political wing of that organization. And Mr. Modi is not only the best-known leader of that organization, he is also the Prime Minister of India, coming from the BJP, which is the political heir, the political wing of the RSS, which part of its documentation, part of its core principles is to turn India into a Hindu nation where non-Hindus, who are about 20% of India's population of 1.3 billion, the non-Hindus such as Muslims and Christians, as well as Sikhs, they do not have any rights, or they have far fewer civil and political rights than Hindus have. That is a stated goal of the RSS, and that is how it has been since 1925 when this organization was set up. This organization was one of the people who was the main assassin of Mahatma Gandhi in 1948. There has been lingering doubts about his involvement with this organization, even though this organization has consistently denied it. The fact is that he worked very closely with members of this organization back in the 1930s and the 40s before he went on to assassinate Mahatma Gandhi, who upheld the principles of secularism and India being a diverse country, as Congressman Trent Franks noted. I want to talk about the fact that what has been happening with the rise of Mr. Modi's government is that the hate-filled and bigoted ideology of the RSS has become one of the big motivations behind the widespread human rights violations across India, especially since he became Prime Minister. So we need to understand why this is happening. It is not as if this is happening, this is being done externally by some other people. It is being carried out by people who are connected with the government of the day, and therefore who will have the courage or the conviction of that courage to carry out any kind of counter, presenting a counter to such activities. And of course, we have talked about the Dalits. I'm very glad that you have talked about the Dalits. You see, the ideology of Hindu supremacism is not limited to abusing India's religious minorities. Indeed, the rigidly hierarchical caste system of the Hindu society has for centuries discriminated against those lower down its chain, to such an extent that they have been the infamous untouchables of the Indian society. And then we need to add to this list India's 15% tribal people, who have traditionally inhabited vast forested stretches, millions of who have been forcefully dispossessed of their lands and homes over decades to make way for industrial projects, as you noted just now yourself. And that is why, as a result, thousands of them have been fighting back, in my view, in the view of many of us, in a misplaced fight back. But nonetheless, there is an armed insurgency raging through the central Indian forests today as we speak here. And as a result, what has happened is that paramilitaries are now the only government across much of central India where such insurgency has caught momentum in the last 15 years. And this has led inevitably to massive human rights abuses by local police and the paramilitaries, because they target innocent people, the innocent citizens of India, and put them in prisons on false charges and fabricated evidences. This is something, as you noted, Chairman, Honorable Chairman, I have covered in my journalism through the years. We've seen, I don't want to talk much about the state of Jammu Kashmir, which is a northern Indian state disputed by Pakistan since 1947 when the two countries split from British India. They gained their independence. But the fact that since 1989, especially since 1989, the Indian Army has had a very strong presence in the state of Jammu Kashmir. Thousands and thousands of people are said to have died. They are said to have suffered huge, massive human rights abuses at the hands of the Indian Army, which have been documented. There have been, you talked about the northeastern states of India. There's a law since 1958 on the statute of the Indian Constitution, the same Indian Constitution that guarantees equality before law. There's been a statute in the Indian Constitution which says that armed forces have special powers over certain regions of the country. And for the last 50 years, under those special powers, they have had complete and total impunity from all the crimes that they have committed against the local people there. Just 2 days ago, and I have mentioned that in my written testimony, just 2 days ago, the current chief of the Army's Eastern Command Wing, which is under which that region comes, he clearly said there is no problem. There's no problem with that Armed Forces Special Power Act. It's all fine. Whereas the Supreme Court of India, in its own judgments, and commissions headed by Supreme Court judges have time and again said that this is a completely ridiculous law. It has caused the violations of human rights on an industrial scale, and they should be done away with. I just want to talk very, very briefly about the commonest forms of human rights abuses and violations of civil liberties, which, how do they manifest? One of the forms is extrajudicial killing. It might really come as a surprise to this commission that on an average, 6 people a day are killed in extrajudicial manners in India, in prisons, or in the custody of the police. More than 6 people a day, an average that has only increased over the last 15 to 20 years. When towards the turn of the century, this average used to be about 4 a day. And that is what has been increasing. Across India, well over 1,000 people die every year in the custody of police or in prison. Another way of putting them away has come to be known as quote-unquote encounter killing, whereby the police claim they shot the victim dead in self-defense after the latter had attacked them. Even this practice, the Supreme Court has come down very heavily against this. And we talked about, Congressman Trent Franks talked about the situation in Mr. Modi's Gujarat state where he was the chief minister. This practice of encounter killings was a real menace in that area, in that state, until the bunch of police officers who were responsible for the succession of such killings were caught, they were apprehended, they were accused. And I just want to complete now, just one last point I want to make, Congressman, is that a lot of innocent human beings, citizens of India, Muslims as well as Dalits and tribals, are accused falsely of terror cases, of sedition charges. They're put away in prison and they are freed. They are acquitted of those charges, but only after they have spent 10 or 20 or in some cases even 25 years in prison without once being bailed. So this is a very serious situation. I think it is important to know. The very last point, 1 year from now, I'm really worried that there are elections in India's largest state, a state known as Uttar Pradesh, which has about 200 million people as its population, 200 million. That's almost 2/3 the entire population of the United States. This is a state where there was major sectarian violence with very well-documented involvement of the BJP's people back in 2013, just before Mr. Modi became Prime Minister. And there is a big fear that ahead of those state legislative elections, there might be attempts by such people to revive those kinds of hatred and bigotry and apprehend that there might be violence again in that state. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
Chair thanks the gentleman and now recognizes Mr. Kumar, 5 minutes for your summary.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of Congress. Amnesty International is pleased to be here to testify about a country of concern like any other countries. The timing, as John mentioned, is appropriate because the Prime Minister of India is here and having a meeting with President Obama as well as speaking here in the Congress. I just want to touch on major issues there in India. Not go into depth because of the time constraints. First, I will go to the conflict areas. There are 3 conflict zones. Conflict means where the armed struggle is taking place. One is Kashmir. Second is Northeast India. Third is more central and eastern part of India, where the Maoists are fighting for whatever the rights they are looking for. In these 3 areas, the first 2 areas, Kashmir as well as northeast provinces, there is a particular law called Armed Powers Act, Special Powers Act, that's pretty much giving protection to security forces from being brought to justice. So it has been given green light, so they can abuse anything, including rape, killing, everything, but they will never be held accountable. This law has been in place for several years under different governments. There is one case I would like to brought it up as far as Special Powers Act. Her name is Irom Shirama. She is from a northeastern state called Manipur. She has been on a hunger strike taking liquids for the last 14 years against this. But the government is arresting her, imprisoning her, accusing her of trying to commit suicide because of her fasting. But she is determined and her hunger strike is still going on. Amnesty International has adopted her as a prisoner of conscience and urging Indian authorities to release her immediately and unconditionally. The other conflict area is the Maoist areas where the left-wing Maoists are fighting for their rights, mostly from the tribal communities, most of their areas of concentration. There the abuses are happening by both sides, like in other parts, in Kashmir as well as in northeast India. Extrajudicial execution, sexual abuses, all these things are happening, and also Indian troops are using paramilitaries to attack and abuse the tribal people there. And also the armed Maoist groups also commit abuses there. The second part I would like to touch on is the identity-based mass killings that took place in India. First is, as you mentioned in the opening remarks, is 2002 killing of around 2,000 plus Muslims. They were targeted because of the identity as Muslims. They were massacred, women were raped, children were killed. And current Prime Minister was the Chief Minister at that time. The issue there was so much uproar that people have to be brought to justice. And we saw the news that about 2 weeks ago, about 24 people have been convicted. But still, more has to be done in Gujarat. There are so many people have to be held accountable for the mass killing of Muslims there. The other killing that rarely get attention is the killing of Sikhs in 1980s, early 80s. This happened in Delhi, mostly in Delhi, after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, former Prime Minister. And the mobs went on rampage, targeting Sikhs for their identity, again, on the religious identity. Killed more than 3,000 people. Women were sexually abused and raped. Women were killed. And few, if anyone, have been brought to justice for those killings. This 30 years ago this happened. That has to be brought to attention to ensure that until and unless past mass killings and abuses have been taken into account, future abusers will feel extremely comfortable to abuse and kill innocent people. The third aspect that I would like to address is the Dalit or untouchables. This is part of the ancient system in the religion, Hindu religion, where a certain section of the community have been treated like untouchables. And abuses have been going on against them for centuries. It's nothing new. And there were attempts to bring to some protection to them as well as to empower them. There were some laws that were brought to bring some affirmative action to bring them up, that community up. But still we have seen killings because of the identity. Recently, in a state of Kerala in the south, which ironically it's a communist-run state, a Dalit woman was raped and killed. In Tamil Nadu, the next state, one Dalit man was killed for getting married or dating an upper caste woman. So it's more of an honor-killing issue there. So what we are trying to see is there are layers of abuses that are happening in India. Number one, conflict areas, Kashmir, Northeast Province, and Maoist-infected central part of India. Second, identity-based killings of Muslims, Sikhs, and now we are seeing, now it has been going on against Dalits. Then, as everyone knew, the violence against women have taken a different turn over the years. There were attempts to address it. The attention was brought because of the gang rape of a young woman in Delhi. And as a result, there was some movements, but that's not enough. So we would urge that Congress to have a special attention on the violence against women and empowerment of women in India. The media freedom is also of concern to us because of the conflict zone, especially in Chittigar, that's in the central part, the Maoist area. Journalists have been persecuted, abused, and silenced, even attacked by vigilantes as well as the security forces. The other area is the recent increase of application of foreign funding. This particular law has been on the books for a long time, but it has taken a new turn recently, where there are groups like Greenpeace and other groups have been banned or suspended from receiving foreign funds. They can actually ask these organizations to report rather than stopping funding, because if you want transparency, they can obviously ask for transparency and reporting. The final one that I would like to address is basically two countries are involved, the US and India. The case of Bhopal. This is about 30 years ago. A Union Carbide, US corporation, had an industrial factory in a place called Bhopal. And gas leaked overnight, and 7,000 people died within 3 days. Still, thousands are suffering from all kinds of health problems, including stillbirth. The area has not been cleaned. It's still contaminated. The Union Carbide and then whichever company that Dow Chemical now bought it, they all washed their hands and ran away from India, allowing these people to suffer for the last 30 years. The issue, what we are concerned is, a summons was issued by the Bhopal Magistrate Court against Union Carbide, and it has been rejected. No, the Union Carbide is pretty much ignoring it. That's where we want President Obama to take the leadership, to ensure one of the US corporations that is directly involved in the killing through their neglect should face justice. I mean, let them go and tell the magistrate that we are not at fault, but you are not facing that. So we are surprised that even Prime Minister Modi did not if at all, I doubt he raised it today. So that issue should be addressed, as well as this also happened about 30 years ago. Thank you very much for inviting Amnesty International.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. And we'll start questioning. I'll recognize myself for that purpose. Mr. Sifton, in your written testimony, you refer to the use of sedition law and criminal defamation law to prosecute citizens who criticize government officials. You also cite the case of a student union leader at the university in Delhi who was arrested along with 2 other fellow students on charges of sedition, despite little basis for the charges. My question is this: in your opinion, has the use of these laws to silence critics expanded in recent years, or has this been standard practice for some time? Are there other examples of this type of overstep that you can share? What's the current status of this case?
On the one hand, I want to acknowledge that this problematic law has not simply been abused by the current government. The Congress Party, when they were in power, also misused or allowed local governments to misuse both the sedition law, the criminal defamation law, and other problematic laws that we've outlined in our recent report. However, it is also the case that by our analysis, the use of these laws has increased under the current government, and taken in combination with the regulations that are allowed under the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which doesn't allow criminal charges per se, although you can be criminally charged in certain instances, you do see essentially a campaign by the Modi government to use legal restrictions and penal provisions on the books to go after voices of dissent. But not just voices of dissent who create criticism of projects and developmental projects and other things that the government wishes to advance, but in particular voices of dissent who are targeting the Modi government as the Modi government. So in other words, a distinction I'm raising here is during the Congress government, you had a misuse of certain laws in Tamil Nadu to go after local activists who were criticizing nuclear power plants that were being designed for the Tamil Nadu coast. They were worried about tsunamis and meltdowns like in Japan. It was illegitimate for the government to misuse the law to go after that, but it wasn't political per se. They just were angry at these local dissidents for raising these concerns. The Modi government, by contrast, is using a lot of these laws to go after people who threaten it as the ruling party.
So in your opinion, what has the effect been on human rights groups? Others maybe who publicly critique government policy?
Well, I don't want to overstate the case because India has a very boisterous and vibrant media, civil society, and society generally. On the other hand, there is a chilling effect. There are smaller groups, less courageous voices who undoubtedly are silencing themselves and censoring themselves because of the government's overreach. So there can be no doubt about that on that point. I just want to say one last thing about the sedition law. This law is a colonial era hangover. Mahatma Gandhi was prosecuted under the sedition law, and the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru himself, criticized the law. He said, as far as I'm concerned, that particular section, the sedition law, is highly objectionable and obnoxious, and it should have no place for both practical and historic reasons in any body of laws that we might pass. The sooner we get rid of it, the better.
Thank you. Mr. Sahi, in your testimony, you reference a, quote, pervasive culture of impunity for abuses by police and security forces, including abuses towards those in police custody. My question is, how has this culture of impunity changed in recent years? What, if any, social or political factors may be driving it? And elaborate a little bit more on what you call the encounter killings and judicial challenges faced for family members who are victims of these crimes.
Right, Honorable Chairman. The first part is so the perversity of impunity. Now it works in a very self-evident manner. What happens is that when so let us say that there is an encounter killing by the police and I have put some incidents also. So what the police do right at the beginning, they start to dilute the case. The investigation is shoddy. The first report that needs to go down, that needs to be written down, often does not name the killers, even if they are known, if their identities are known, they are not named. The evidences are collected not in the manner that is prescribed under the law, and therefore they are questioned by the defense at the stage of the trial, and the courts normally uphold them. And also the fact that trials of such cases are delayed. There is impunity. So first of all, trials are not all the cases are brought to trial. I would say 90% of such cases are just not brought to trial. Now, there is only so much that a family can fight for. There is only so much that civil society can fight for. When and if and when a case is indeed brought to trial, the trial itself takes time. In India, the judicial system works in such a manner that someone is arrested and accused. At the same time, for the what is called the charge sheet, or basically the charges, for the prosecution to present those charges before the court, the trial court, could take anything. There are cases, I know of cases going back all the way to 1996, 97, in which no charges have yet been filed, but they continue to be on the record books. Now, moving forward, what happens then is, if the charges are filed, if the trial begins, there are repeated adjournments. Cases take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, witnesses die, or there are people who are offered money, and people take money and then they just walk away. Witnesses walk away after taking money from the case. Even the families of victims walk away from the case. On the encounter killings, this is nothing but it's murder in cold blood. And unfortunately, you will find there are actually in India, in Bollywood, which is the Bombay film industry, the Indian film industry, has made movies about cops, about policemen who have killed 100 people or 120 people in their careers. And that's how they behave. So the people at large are accepting of such encounter killings, because what they say, what is said about such killings is, oh well, the legal jurisprudence system in India is too slow, it takes too much time, how will these criminals be put out, so therefore it's okay for the police to kill them. But what happens is 90% of the time, I would say probably more, they are innocent people who are being killed. And in any case, in 100% of the cases, it is not the police which can take the law in their own hands and start killing people without taking them to trial. And that is what is happening. Of course, the level of encounter killings that happen in a place like Jammu and Kashmir or in the central Indian forest, they have a political dimension to it, as Mr. Kumar mentioned just now. They have, and Mr. Sifton also said, they have a very strong political dimension to it. But in the rest of India, they're just routine without any political element. It's just that the police are king in the areas wherever they are. They can kill anybody with impunity and no questions asked.
Thank you. Mr. Kumar, in May, Amnesty International reported on the murder of a journalist in the state of Bihar and called for Indian authorities to end impunity for attacks on journalists. My question to you is, to what extent do recent incidents of violence or arrest targeting members of the media reflect a change in tolerance for India's typically robust freedom of the press? Are there any trends connected to those who are targeted?
Not to our knowledge. Our record shows that in the conflict zones, especially the Maoist-inflicted area, the silencing of media is continuing, if not increased. So we are not seeing any improvements. There may be some minor steps, but we are not seeing any improvements in the conflict areas.
Thank you. In your opinion, what are the most effective strategies for civil society and government entities seeking to engage the Indian government on the topic of human rights?
The best way to do is for them to be vocal, not to be shied away, and not to politicize it. That's extremely important. The minute you politicize human rights struggle, like even in this country, then they will become more defensive. So less politicize it and keep it as a fundamental human rights. And media groups should get together with legal law societies and civil society groups. India has thousands of civil society organizations and have a major campaign. And this international organizations can supplement the dynamics that's going on inside. But most importantly, Chairman, what's disturbing is that President Obama went to India, never spoke a word about human rights, including Bhopal. There were Bhopal victims were demonstrating, he didn't care about them. And now I bet today they met, not a word would have been mentioned. It should have. It's not about anti-India, it's pro-India. It's basically saying we are a little concerned. So that also creating some concerns that international community is giving a green light or pass to Indian government, not only to this government, even previous governments. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Co-Chair Ms. McGovern for his questions.
Well, thank you all very much for your testimony, and it's all very troubling, and the trends are troubling. All of us, need to be concerned and pay close attention to, what happens going forward. I know that, there are some in the Indian government that would prefer that we don't have this hearing and that we don't talk about human rights. That's not unique amongst governments when it comes to talking about human rights records, even our own government, as Mr. Sifton pointed out, that we're not perfect. And it's always inconvenient and it bothers people when we talk about our own shortcomings. But it is important that we do speak out, because otherwise nothing's going to change. It's always a challenge to try to figure out what are the most effective ways to communicate, what are the most effective messages, because at the end of the day, I mean, we're all interested not in just giving speeches. We want to see progress. We want to know how we can bring the government and institutions along to change. So with Prime Minister Modi will be here to speak to a joint session of Congress tomorrow, and I'd be curious to hear from you. What do you think are the most important human rights messages that the U.S. Congress and the administration should send to him during his visit? Is the United States missing any opportunities to constructively encourage the Indian government to do more to comply with its human rights obligations? Is the U.S. doing enough to communicate concerns that the crackdown against civil society and/or the overly broad application of anti-terrorism laws could backfire in India? Mr. Kumar mentioned that President Obama missed an opportunity when he visited India. We can't change the past; we can only shape the future. So the question is, give us. I open this to all of you. Like, how do we move forward here effectively? Again, this is not about politics. This is about dignity and respect for human rights. And so I'd appreciate any advice or comments that any of you may have. Yeah, Ms. Sifton?
I think President Obama did raise the issues of religious discrimination, violence against religious minorities in his own subtle way, over-subtle way. I know the State Department has raised concerns. I would like those concerns to be raised more volubly, but they have been raised. I think what members of Congress and other government officials can do is keep raising them, because I believe Prime Minister Modi thinks, regardless of what he actually thinks about religious minorities, he knows that violence against religious minorities can pose a threat to his standing on the world stage. And if he's reminded that the world is looking, that the world is watching, he may be more likely to act to restrict and stop or prevent violence against religious minorities, even if he doesn't really care about religious minorities. So that's one thing. Just keep reminding, keep pushing them that the world is watching. Now, a more subtle way to raise human rights issues that I think can be done very directly is on the issue of the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act and the clampdown on civil society. We can point out the contradiction in Prime Minister Modi's invitation to foreign investors and U.S. companies in particular to come in, to bring U.S. money into India, make in India, to produce in India, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a seeming restriction on foreign funding for nonprofits and charities. So it's as if he's saying you can bring in all the money in the world to support businesses, but if it's a non-business, if it's non-profit, then it has to be heavily restricted. Right. So the business community here can play a huge role, and I encourage members of Congress to push the business community to raise the issue. They even have their own direct reason to raise it. Many U.S. corporations have foundations, right, which have to be set up, and they can raise it just for their own foundations in particular.
Thank you.
Congressman, I would like to add, agreeing with what Mr. Sifton has just said, I would like to add that the Indian government, the Indian police, the government, the internal security apparatus, they are now looking to heavily arm themselves in dealing with civilian populations, with things like such as drones, with things such as taser guns. Now, those are the kind of things I shudder to imagine how they would be used in a place like India, where, as Mr. Kumar said, there are thousands of civil society organizations on any given day. If you Google India, you will find protests happening all over India. Now, if the Indian police were to be so heavily armed, I think that is something that the international community needs to look at. Where would the drones be used? Where would the taser guns be used? That's one part. I just want to also thank you, Congressman, for saying that your own government also does not have a very clean record. I'm very happy to hear that, because not that it doesn't have a good record, but that before before I set out from India to come here, I was advised by many people, my friends and colleagues, that, it is not a good idea to go and criticize India on a foreign platform, especially at the US Congress. And I agree with Mr. Kumar that this is not criticism of India, this is not anti-India, this is pro-India, because we want India to commit itself to the implementation of its own constitutional provisions and promises and guarantees. So I am entirely pro-India, I am not anti-India, and that I wanted to put that on record.
you.
Thank you.
It has to be two-way street, especially when it comes to US. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman and Congressman, the Bhopal tragedy, 30 years ago, it happened. 7,000 people died instantly within 3 days. Thousands are still suffering. An Indian court issued a warrant, and still, almost even next July 13th is the next date. Dow Chemical is refusing, and the Justice Department is not taking any steps. So it's better, as an example, US Congress can write to Justice Department and say, please make sure that Dow Chemical go and face and be present in the court of law in Bhopal and say that they are innocent. Let them say that. But hiding here and not saying anything is pretty much, the impression that will be given is that you are not respecting Indian judiciary.
Right.
So that should be something you can do. Second is something you can raise the issues like the Special Powers Act in Northeast India and Kashmir, extrajudicial executions, and also the media freedom. And you will have more authority. You will have more strength when you say, here we want Dow Chemical to go and face the magistrate in Bhopal. The same breath you say, wait a minute, you should not keep Armed Powers Act there. It will have more impact and more effectiveness. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. You've given us a lot to follow up on, and I just want to conclude by saying, again, I think at least I come to this hearing today out of respect for India and out of friendship. And if friendship, by the very definition of friendship, if a friend is doing something that you think is not in their best interest, you tell them. You urge them to change. If you remain silent, you're not much of a friend. Similarly, when I'm critical of my own government, when I think we don't live up to the high standards of human rights that I think we should, it's because I love my country. I want to beckon it to a higher standard. And so, I think all of us here, are very much pro-India and certainly pro the people of India. But human rights is a serious matter, and I just finally say that that this commission is going to continue to raise these issues, and we're going to follow up on a lot of your recommendations. But we're not going away, and we'll continue to urge our administration to be stronger in its advocacy for human rights in India. But we will also continue to remind the Indian government when we think there are examples where they have fallen short on the issue of human rights that they need to address them. And so I look forward to working with all of you. So thank you. You're back.
Chair thanks the gentleman and echoes his sentiments. We will have some follow-up questions. We'll have some questions in writing from other members of the commission. We'll send those to you. We ask that you please respond in writing as soon as you can. Thank you very much. I'll now excuse panel 1 and call panel 2 to the witness table, and I will introduce the second panel in the order of their presentation. First, we have Mr. Jeff King, is the president of International Christian Concern, an organization that exists to relieve the suffering of the worldwide persecuted church, help it grow in strength and breadth by providing effective assistance, advocacy, and awareness. Mr. King has served as president of ICC since the fall of 2002. He's traveled to almost 60 countries investigating persecution, delivering aid to those suffering for their religious beliefs. Secondly, we have Mr. Mossadegh Thongay. He is currently the Communications Director for the Indian American Muslim Council, the IAMC, an advocacy organization dedicated to safeguarding India's pluralist and tolerant ethos. As Communications Director for IAMC, Thong has been actively involved in working with IAMC's coalition partners to create awareness about issues of human rights and religious freedom in India. Thirdly, we have Martina Vandenberg, the founder and president of the Human Trafficking Pro Bono Legal Center. Vandenberg has spent nearly 2 decades fighting human trafficking, forced labor, rape as a war crime, and violence against women. Vandenberg has represented victims of human trafficking pro bono in immigration, criminal, and civil cases. And finally, Mr. Raj Cherokandu is a Dalit activist and entrepreneur with the Dalit movements in India and around the world, inspired by the vision of Dr. Ambedkar. He's the current president of the Ambedkar Association of North America. Through this work, he has connected Dalits in the diaspora with vital anti-caste discrimination movements in India. Welcome. We appreciate very much your coming today. Mr. King, you're recognized 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Press the button, yeah.
I'd like to thank the members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, and specifically the co-chairman, Mr. Pitts and Mr. McGovern, for hosting this important hearing and for giving me the opportunity to speak concerning the status of human rights and religious liberty in India. As the president of International Christian Concern, a non-governmental organization that exists to provide direct assistance, awareness, and advocacy to the persecuted Christian church, we investigate and we document instances of persecution around the world, and India has been a focus of our organization. In a country of great concern, as we see many Christians and other religious minorities facing escalating persecution for their faith. Human rights in India, and specifically religious freedom, is predicated upon a history of stratifying individuals by social class and religion. While India claims to be a pluralistic society and has constitutional protections for religious freedom, the fact remains that religious minorities, specifically Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs, are too often victims of religious persecution, including forced conversions, violent assaults, social boycotts, and these limit their access to work as well as cultural and social services. While the government of India is not directly involved in perpetrating these crimes, the relative silence of Prime Minister Modi and government authorities is deafening. India's constitution guarantees full religious freedom, including an individual's ability to freely profess, practice, and propagate religion. Now, despite the constitutional protection, there's little respect for the rule of law, and the government fails to enforce this right for members of India's religious minority communities. Hindu extremists, such as the RSS and its subsidiaries, the VHP and Bajrang Dal, act with impunity against religious minorities. Unfortunately, this lack of law enforcement action and even condemnation from the Indian government has led to an increase in instances of persecution. Prime Minister Modi has been a lifelong member of the RSS, and his political party, the BJP, has close ties to the Hindu radical group. And during his time as the Chief Minister of Gujarat State, the United States government denied Mr. Modi a travel visa to the U.S. under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. He's the only individual ever to be banned under this law. This 2005 decision was based on his failure to protect religious minorities from Hindu radical violence in Gujarat, demonstrating Modi's checkered past with religious freedom. Now, International Christian Concern is tracking a trend of increased attacks on Christians, and just since the beginning of 2016, we've documented 109 separate attacks on Christians and their places of worship, and this affects more than 2,400 individuals. Our colleagues at the Catholic Secular Forum reported that there was a massive rise in Christian persecution in 2015, with 365 major attacks, victimizing over 8,000 people from the Christian community. These incidents are not aberrations, as the BJP government has claimed, in 2015 marked the worst year for Christians in India's independent history. And despite this deplorable statistic, Modi and his administration refused to confront the religious intolerance quickly spreading throughout the nation. It must be noted that although these incidents of persecution have taken place in multiple areas of India, Chhattisgarh state has been at the epicenter of persecution, as its Christian community has been attacked on 21 occasions. And these attacks range from vandalism of churches to the beating of church leaders and parishioners to entire Christian communities being socially boycotted by their Hindu neighbors. For instance, on April 17th, Pastor Sameli and his wife Meena, who was 7 months pregnant at the time, were held hostage outside of their church by two individuals, demanding they worship the Hindu deity Ram. And with a sword to his neck, Pastor Sameli refused. The attackers then set fire to his church while he and his wife fled for their lives. Chhattisgarh state also houses the Bastar district, an area where in June 2014, Hindu radicals convinced local community leaders to ban any non-Hindu religious propaganda, prayers, and speeches in the village, a practice which denies religion of freedom for over 300 Christian families in the region. For Christians living in this area, they face a stark choice of converting to Hinduism or being socially boycotted in the village in which they live. The social boycott means that Christians are no longer allowed to access water wells, purchase goods at local stores, work and receive pay, cultivate their fields, graze their livestock, or even talk to Hindu members of the village without being assaulted or fined. A local pastor explained that the Christian community, what the Christian community faces in Bastar by saying, attacks on Christians take place on a daily basis, and every day we hear about Christians being attacked. Some incidents are more cruel than others. These attacks we face from Hindu hardline groups are simply because we practice the Christian faith. Particularly Christians who live in rural areas are more vulnerable and face more frequent attacks. However, these attacks do not get the attention of the media and civil society, and victims don't receive justice from concerned authorities. Most recently, a 22-year-old woman was brutally attacked by activists of the VHP on May 22nd for practicing Christianity in Parapur, a village in the Bastar district. She was dragged from the field where she was working after attending Sunday worship services. She was beaten until she lost consciousness. And through the pressure of Christians on the local police, first FIR was filed, number 27/16, but no arrests have been made to date. This is just one example of many attacks that have taken place in Bastar. In October 2015, the Chhattisgarh High Court ruled that outlawing of non-Hindu religions is unconstitutional. Despite this ruling, the spread of these resolutions in Chhattisgarh and the practice of social boycotting Christians has continued to this day. Just recently, in April 2016, the villages of Baid Themli and Kermari passed resolutions banning the practice of non-Hindu religions, despite the ruling from the High Court. In spite of thousands of Indian citizens in Chhattisgarh being denied their constitutional rights, Prime Minister Modi continues to ignore these clear constitutional violations. This denial of religious freedom over the last 2 years has coincided with Modi's tenure in power. Members of India's Muslim population have also faced religious persecution. In September 2015, Muhammad Saif, a 52-year-old Muslim man, was brutally murdered by a mob of angry Hindus who accused him of slaughtering a cow. 6 weeks later, another Muslim man was accused of stealing a cow and killed by another mob. And these murders came at a time when Modi's political party, the BJP, were aggressively pushing beef bans at the state level, and in addition, the BJP ran campaign ads accusing its political opponents of insulting the holy cow. Further evidence of the lack of respect for religious liberty and human rights is India's denial of travel visas to USCIRF, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. This is the third time that the Indian government has failed to provide travel visas for USCIRF to investigate religious intolerance throughout India. The chairman of USCIRF, Robert P. George, stated of the visa denial, USCIRF has been able to travel to many countries, including those that are among the worst offenders of religious freedom, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, China, and Burma. One would expect that the Indian government would allow for more transparency than have these nations and would welcome the opportunity to convey its views directly to USCIRF. In addition to the culture of impunity that is allowed to persist, BJP leaders and their ideological allies have actively participated in the propagation of intolerance against India's religious minorities. In January of 2015, a BJP member of the parliament stated, wait for some time, a law will be passed in Parliament in which anyone indulging cow slaughter and conversion will be punished with a death sentence. Another federal minister in Modi's cabinet stated that the Bible and the Quran are not central to the soul of India in the same way as the Gita and Ramayana are. Sadhvi Deva Thakur, an ideological adherent to extreme Hindu nationalism, demanded the population of Muslims and Christians is growing day by day. To rein this in, the central government will have to impose emergency actions, and Muslims and Christians will have to be forced to undergo sterilization so that they cannot increase their numbers. She went on to say that the statues of Hindu gods and goddesses should be placed in mosques and churches. And these quotes clearly display the attitude of some BJP members and their allies seeking to coalesce political power through religiously charged statements. And extremist views like these were not confronted nor condemned by Modi or his administration, further cultivating the growing intolerance that persists within India. It is my sincere hope and prayer that the ongoing efforts of this Commission of International Christian Concern and many other organizations working to draw attention to these issues will encourage the Indian government to first acknowledge that these problems exist and then to take concrete action to enforce the full religious freedom that is guaranteed by its Constitution. Thank you again to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for bringing awareness to this critical issue and for the opportunity to provide testimony.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen, and now recognizes Mr. Thangay, 5 minutes for his summary.
Thank you, Honorable Chairman and members of the Commission. My name is Musaddiq Thangay, and I represent the Indian American Muslim Council, an advocacy organization dedicated to safeguarding India's pluralist and tolerant ethos. As somebody born and raised in India and who now calls America his home, I have a deep and abiding respect for the diversity and freedom of religion that mark the history of both nations. It is this shared legacy of respectful coexistence of many faiths that gives me hope to come before you today to speak about the steady attrition of these very values in the world's largest democracy. I was a young college student in 1992 when the demolition of a 400-year-old historic mosque convulsed Indian society and the violent aftermath of that demolition. Along with my friends, Hindus, Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs, I was convinced we were in a long struggle to save India's soul from hate and extremism. In the ensuing 23 years, the country witnessed several major episodes of mass violence against minorities, such as the anti-Christian violence of Orissa in 1998, the rapes and burning alive of people in Gujarat in 2002, the targeted violence in Muzaffarnagar in 2013, and the massacres in Assam in 2012 and 2014. Since 2009, India has been on the Tier 2 list of countries where religious freedom is at risk, reported by the US Commission for International Religious Freedom. But even with this checkered past, the developments of the last 2 years are especially worrisome and have profound implications for the situation of minorities and for what they portend for the future of India as a secular polity. They also represent a challenge for the international community. A measure of where things have come can be understood from an open letter written by a former Navy chief, Admiral Ramdas, to President Pranab Mukherjee in October of 2015, calling his attention to, I quote, a systematic and well-orchestrated attempt to impose a majoritarian single-point agenda of creating a Hindu Rashtra, meaning a Hindu nation in India, close quote. Among other things, what had shocked the Admiral most was that attacks on minorities and Dalits did not elicit condemnation from those at the helm of affairs. Indeed, the Admiral is not alone in his consternation and deep misgivings about the intentions of the current administration. Last year, over 40 writers and intellectuals returned prestigious awards in a unified protest against the suppression of dissent taking hold in the country. India's intellectual class clearly has reasons to worry about the country's future. According to Pew Research's landmark reports on global restrictions on religions, India has consistently ranked in the top 3 countries of the world with the highest levels of social hostilities against religious communities. And in the latest Pew report, India actually tops the list. Even before coming to power, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the ruling party now, and their actions were clear in fomenting sectarianism. 2 state legislators who had been arrested for inciting violence during the massacres of Muzaffarnagar were honored by the party at a rally for Mr. Modi. A senior leader of the party said those opposed to Mr. Modi have no place in India and should go to Pakistan. And after the party came to power, it continued in the same vein. The Prime Minister, who was able to tweet birthday greetings to prominent people, took months before he even addressed the attacks on 5 churches and a Christian school, and even then, his words fell short of an unequivocal condemnation. Mr. Modi's response to the campaign of forced conversions to Hinduism, launched by extremist organizations like the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, was to challenge the opposition to support an anti-conversion law, which is usually implemented in a way that curbs conversions out of Hinduism. Hindu supremacist organizations affiliated to the RSS have begun to glorify Mahatma Gandhi's assassin even more openly and are now calling for a day of celebration to mark the assassination. In September last year, Mr. Yogi Adityanath and Mr. Sakshi Maharaj, both members of the ruling party and both members of parliament from the ruling party, called for laws to curb the country's Muslim population. So one often hears that the violence, the inflammatory rhetoric, and the disregard for religious freedom are espoused by the fringe elements of the Hindu nationalist movement. And that brings me really to the crux of my testimony. There is really nothing to differentiate the core from the fringe, or the BJP and the RSS from the rabid offshoots who carry out their bidding. Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Ms. Nisha Desai Biswal, had recently praised India's vibrant civil society, saying there is no more robust voice than the voice of the Indian people that is taking up issues of religious freedom. I respectfully disagree. It is well known that whistleblowers and activists have been subjected to unprecedented harassment and intimidation in India in recent years. Moreover, the Indian judiciary is facing a crisis of credibility, as acknowledged by the Chief Justice of India himself. The courts in India have a collective pendency of a staggering 30 million cases, with a significant number over a decade old. The system facilitates willful delays for the rich and powerful and fosters a sense of impunity for human rights violators. In other words, judicial ineffectiveness is an enabler of human rights violations. Therefore, the expectation that the Indian system would somehow self-correct is naive and unrealistic. The international community has a responsibility to help bring about change, albeit in a way that respects India's sovereignty. To that end, I call upon this Commission and its honorable members to work towards the inclusion of human rights and religious freedom in the US-India strategic dialogue. As part of a continued dialogue, we must urge India to enact adequate laws to protect whistleblowers and witnesses. Organizations that are working on the ground to ensure justice to the victims and heal divisions between Hindus and Muslims need encouragement and support and must be recognized for their contributions to peace and pluralism. The struggle to save India's tradition of pluralism may be daunting, but it is a struggle that many in India and around the world have taken up as their own. The forces of division may be strong, but they cannot and must not be allowed to overpower people's natural yearning for peace. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Thank you.
Chair thanks gentlemen and now recognizes Ms. Vandenberg. 5 minutes for summary.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Chairman Pitts. It's an honor to be here today to testify before the Lantos Commission on Human Rights. If there's been a theme of today's hearing, I would say that theme has been impunity. And this afternoon, I'd like to touch briefly again on that theme, impunity, addressing 3 issues relating to human trafficking in India. The first point is the situation of trafficking in India itself. The second is retaliation against trafficking victims outside of India. And the third is trafficking of domestic workers by Indian consular officials right here in the United States. So I'll begin with trafficking, forced labor, bonded labor, and slavery in India. International experts agree that India has by far the largest number of people in bonded and forced labor in the entire world. Estimates range widely on the precise numbers. Indeed, India's Minister for Women and Child Development recently categorically rejected the 18 million figure of people in modern slavery just released in India. However, the International Labor Organization has estimated that there are at least 11.7 million victims in the region. So whatever the precise number is, the sheer volume of human trafficking and forced labor in India is nothing short of shocking. Millions of Indian men, women, and children are held in the sex industry, in brick kilns, in rice mills, in agriculture, in factories, in forced begging, in domestic work, even in embroidery production facilities. I'll give you an example of impunity. Entire families may be held in India as bonded labor in brick kilns, saddled with debt that they can never pay off. And the perpetrators of these crimes have little to fear. In one recent case, police and an NGO rescued more than 300 victims, including more than 80 children, from forced labor and bonded labor in a brick kiln. But media reports indicated that just the year before, 333 victims had been rescued from this very same brick kiln. But because the owners faced no criminal charges, because the owners were not prosecuted, not convicted, they simply went out and found a whole new set of victims to hold in bonded labor. They simply recruited new laborers. Impunity in the face of human trafficking and forced labor in India is the norm. India has refused to provide data to the US government on prosecutions and convictions as part of the reporting for the Trafficking in Persons report, which is issued each summer each year. But non-governmental organizations on the ground report that prosecutions and convictions are quite low. A recent Harvard study, for example, reported that in the case of child forced labor, police file legally mandated reports, FIRs, only, quote, sporadically, and traffickers are, quote, rarely prosecuted. Impunity for unscrupulous and unregulated labor recruiters is particularly problematic. The 2015 State Department Trafficking in Persons report also points to widespread corruption in India, corruption that allows human trafficking to flourish. In the words of the TIP report, some corrupt law enforcement officers protect suspected traffickers and brothel owners from enforcement of the law, take bribes from sex trafficking establishments, demand sexual services from victims, and tip off sex and labor traffickers to impede rescue efforts. The Indian government has publicly admitted that trafficking victims are prosecuted. A June 1, 2016 Associated Press story quoted an Indian government minister stating, quote, "At present the law says that the trafficked and the trafficker are both criminals and they both go to jail." While there is draft legislation to correct this, I must emphasize that that is draft legislation, and this is currently the law. Moving now to violations of the rights of Indian trafficking victims abroad. India not only has a significant trafficking problem at home, it is a country of origin for thousands of victims around the world, including victims right here in the United States. One measure of a government's seriousness in combating trafficking is the treatment that is meted out to its own citizens, victims of trafficking, seeking consular support from their own government while stranded abroad. The Indian government's treatment of trafficking victims in the United States is appalling. In fact, it is the worst case that I have seen in 20 years of working on human trafficking. As you are aware, advocates for trafficking victims obtain T visas to allow them to remain in the United States. We routinely obtain T visas for family members, derivative T visas, for family members to join those T principal visa holders here in the United States. But the Indian government blackmails those Indian trafficking victims here in the United States, demanding that they provide full copies of their T visa applications to the government in order to obtain a passport, a replacement passport. Retaliation against trafficking victims is Indian government state policy. Family members with T derivative visas to come to the United States legally to join their family member have literally been pulled out of departure lines, their passports seized by Indian immigration officials at the airport. Indian trafficking victims have themselves sued their own government. The High Court of Kerala ruled that government policy of seizing passports and refusing departure to family members violated the Indian Constitution. In fact, the court held, quote, "The right to travel is a fundamental right guaranteed and protected under Article 21 of the Constitution of India. The right to life includes the right of a spouse and children to join, to be in the company, and to grow with the spouse and parents. the government of India is directed to permit and enable the petitioners to travel to the USA. But the abuse continues. Most recently, India has begun stamping the newly issued Indian passports issued for T visa recipients here in the United States with a statement that the bearer is a victim of human trafficking. This is the equivalent of stamping these passports with a scarlet T. Governments are required to protect the confidentiality of victims of trafficking, not to declare their victim status to all who examine their passport. Let me turn briefly now to the trafficking of domestic workers here in the United States by Indian consular officials. Foreign diplomats and consular officials here in the United States are permitted to bring domestic workers on A3 and G5 visas. Because these visas tie the domestic workers to their employers, the workers are extremely vulnerable to abuse. 3 separate cases at the federal level have been brought alleging trafficking of domestic workers into this country by Indian consular officials. Abuse of A3 and G5 workers across the board, including abuse by Indian officials posted to the United States, prompted Congress to pass extensive protections for these workers. And one of the remedies that Congress mandated in 2008 provided for the suspension of governments from bringing workers on A3 and G5 visas for countries that have cases where the country has tolerated the abuse. In 2014, a coalition of non-governmental organizations, including my own, called for the suspension of India from the A3G5 visa program for domestic workers. But Secretary Kerry did not suspend India. Instead, India appears to have found a way to circumvent the protections for domestic workers. There are reports that Indian officials now request A2 visas for those workers. But A2 visas are restricted to technical and administrative staff of India's. Of consulates, administrative staff of embassies and consulates. India is flouting the protections passed by this Congress. An A2 visa is nothing short of a license to exploit, and that is simply unacceptable. We have provided extensive recommendations for action, including the demotion of India to Tier 3 status in this year's trafficking report in our written testimony, and I stand ready to answer any of your questions. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and now recognizes Mr. Raj Cherukonda, 5 minutes for his summary.
Honorable Chairman and members of the Commission, thanks for giving me this opportunity. It's a great honor to be here today, and I convey my greetings from our Dalit community. I'm speaking on behalf of a Dalit Federation, which representing 20 Dalit organizations. I myself is a survivor of a brutal caste system, and I would like to speak on behalf of 250 million Dalits whose calls for equity and justice must be heard. Here are some important points. Number 1, as more Dalits assert our rights and engage with the government services, we see an increase in caste-based atrocities against our Dalit communities. These atrocities range from physical assault, public humiliation, burning of homes, social exclusion, custodial violence, rapes, and mass murders. Number 2, while there are numerous laws to address caste-based atrocities, there is an utter failure when it comes to implementation and execution of these laws. According to India's own National Crime Bureau statistics, there is an increase of 44% caste-based atrocities over the past 5 years. And some of the most terrible incidents in the year of 2015, 2 infants set on fire by dominant caste in Haryana. The murders and rapes of Dalit students named Delta and Jisha. The false branding of Dalit student, research scholar Rohit Vemula as an anti-national, which led to his suspension and eventually he committed suicide. The death of 1,300 manual scavengers who are Dalits, they're all forced to clean the human waste, I'm sorry to say, the shit of dominant caste. Each of these cases represent an alarming lawlessness towards the Dalit community in India. The police are the biggest problem as they discourage reporting, investigation, and accountability in these caste-based cases. As a result, by 2015 itself, 85% of all these hate-based crimes based on caste discrimination are still pending and waiting in the courts. Additionally, in 2015, we saw a spotlight on caste discrimination on India's campuses in the universities. These include improper implementation of affirmative action for students and for the faculty, Dalit faculty, delay of scholarship funds to the Dalit students, caste student culture where Dalits are targeted, bullied, and even assaulted physically, caste grading in the schools, and the curriculum standards are increasing. And number 4, in 2015, there were a 57% budget cut in allotment towards Dalits. It's like the set-aside funds are being utilized elsewhere. It's a violation of our economic rights, further increasing our vulnerability to face the violence. Number 5, year 2015, we saw many gaps for enforcement of government affirmative action programs towards Dalits in the areas of education, employment, and also in government sector. Number 6, in 2015, the status of Dalit women is still a major concern. And my colleague, Martina, extensively talked about Dalit women are vulnerable to physically and sexual violence, trafficking, prostitution, and domestic work. These are, being a Dalit woman, they have two disadvantages, being a woman and being a Dalit. And less than 1% of all these incidents are reported, not even reported. I mean, the statistics we are saying are the stuff which is reported. Number 7, the assignment of ritually polluting jobs leaves Dalits incredibly vulnerable. One such job is manual scavenging, which is removing all the human waste physically, getting into manholes with the hands, they remove it. And there are 3.5 million people who are doing this job. This is unconstitutional in India, and our own biggest, the world biggest Indian Railway is the biggest of violators. When they make the coaches, they provide all the facilities like latrines and everything, but when we use it for our purpose, they put a hole so that everything goes down on the road. We are the people, Dalit people, who are going to remove that. So it's a very, very bad situation. And we have some recommendations and humble recommendations, which we think that is going to be probable solutions. We encourage the U.S. government to incorporate Dalit rights into U.S.-Indian relationship and also U.S. policy through additions to the U.S.-India strategic dialogue. And human rights and religious freedom are not currently part of this framework. And this position is in contrast to the U.S. policy with regard to China. And number 2, the time is really ripe and the right time for U.S. to pass resolutions condemning caste-based discrimination similar to other resolutions by the EU and also by UN. With respect to U.S. aid, we hope a portion of U.S. aid grants can be directly administered to Dalits and Adivasis because they all go to the so-called privileged people, and whatever granted comes, it goes there. Finally, we hope that the U.S. can be a partner for all resolutions at the UN, because they never talk about these Dalit rights or human rights. They never talk about caste discrimination in UN, and many of our organizations are not given any permission to get representation in those 18 times. I can give you the name of that organization. For elimination of caste, especially with regard to the UN Millennium Sustainable Development Goals. It is our hope that my testimony as a Dalit Indian American can be compelling argument to how human rights and Dalit rights in a vital and necessary addition to this conversation. Thank you again so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Just one clarification. Did you say 200 million or 250 million Dalits?
250 million.
250? 250 million. Now, is that the, does that also include the Sudra servant class, or that's below the caste of Sudra?
Sudras are supposed to be fourth varna. I mean, least of these four. But within Sudra, we are even down to Sudra. The fellow Sudra don't touch me.
Okay, so Sudra is the servant class. How many million are Sudra?
Sudras would be another equivalent amount of 250 million, but we alone 250, which are below Sudras.
So below Sudra are the untouchables.
Bottom level, we are untouchable. Sudras are touchable, but we are not touchable. We are untouchable.
Thank you for that
Thank you, sir.
clarification. I will begin questioning and recognize myself for that purpose. Mr. King, your organization has been monitoring incidents of violence against the Christian minority in India for over 2 decades. In your opinion, have the number of violent incidents against India's Christian community increased or decreased in recent years? And to what would you attribute any changes that you've observed?
Yeah, I'd say there's a very clear trend, and the trend is upward. It coincides with the rise of Modi and the BJP. In 2014, there were 147 attacks against Christians. 2015, there were 365 attacks. And this year, we've tracked 109 attacks since the beginning of the year, and that basically is on pace with last year. So, simply stated, it's very attributable. The violence, the culture of violence against Christians and religious minorities predates Modi. At the same time, there's been a great increase since his ascension to power.
What, in your opinion, are the primary factors driving these incidents?
Yeah, I would say that the two main factors are impunity, which we keep hearing about. And you see this around the world where there's ongoing persecution, and that's definitely the case in India. The other one is the silence of Modi and his administration. You know, if he would merely speak up, it's relative silence. He's made a few brief, vague comments condemning religious violence. For the most part, he's silent on the issue, and the radical, the Hindu radical, out in the field sees this as tacit approval, and I think they see it correctly as tacit approval. So it's his silence.
So the condemnation might be very general, but not specific as to the incidents? Is that
Yeah,
what you
he's
mean?
made some vague references, or when President Obama referenced attacks, when he's pushed to the wall, he will make some vague statement, but it never feels sincere, it never feels heartfelt, or there's any force behind it. If he would come out and strongly condemn attacks and call for the punishment of perpetrators, it would make a huge difference.
Finally, in your opinion, what could the members of Congress or the administration do to support religious freedom in India more vigorously?
Yeah, I would say more of the same of what we're doing here. You know, there has to be, I think our strongest tool is the bully pulpit, so to speak. If members of Congress and the administration would denounce attacks, if they would publicly prod and use quiet diplomacy to prod for forward progress in religious human rights, that would have a wonderful effect. And I think, as the previous panelist suggested, we should, in some sense, push for, Modi's concerned about his name and his presence and India's presence on the world stage. And I think if we, bring up the shortcomings in terms of religious freedom, that'll have a good effect. The other thing would be to tie future trade agreements to religious freedom, and very importantly, to push for the entry of USURF into India.
Thank you. Mr. Thange, in your testimony, you referenced the use of, quote, reconversion ceremonies, end quote, aimed at compelling members of the Muslim community to convert to Hinduism. My question is, would you be able to expand on how this process works? In what way are these conversions forced? What is the motivating factors behind these ceremonies?
So yes, some of the organizations that are at the forefront of this reconversion movement are basically affiliated to the RSS. They are Hindu Jagran Samiti and some of these players. The way they operate is that they use both threats and monetary incentives, and this is something that they have openly declared. They have actually put a price on how much money it costs to convert a Muslim to Hinduism and how much it costs to convert a Christian to Hinduism, and actually raised funds using those numbers. So they are very transparent about the fact that they are using monetary inducements, but they are also using threats. And this is clear from some of the inflammatory rhetoric that is coming from not people who are outside the administration, but even people who are inside, making statements such as, within a certain period of time, Muslims must convert to Hinduism, or they will be asked to leave the country. So this is part of their stated strategy.
How do the existence of anti-conversion laws in some states affect these programs?
Right. So the way the anti-conversion laws work is that they are basically implemented in a way that seeks to curb conversions out of Hinduism, and by law, then, if there are 5 or 6 states that actually have this law on their books. Under this law, it becomes incumbent on the individual to actually inform the authorities and take permission from a district magistrate before actually converting. And permission is rarely granted to somebody converting out of Hinduism. And if they do find out that somebody has converted without informing the authorities, that person is actually then liable for prosecution. So these anti-conversion laws are a huge impediment, as has been called by U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, that these laws are an impediment to religious freedom.
Do you believe that the number of human rights violations perpetrated against the Muslim population of India, has it increased or decreased in recent years? If so, what explains the change?
Right. So in the last 2 years, there has been uptick of violence against Muslims. So although there has not been a program of the scale of Gujarat or Assam since this administration came to power, there have been several incidents that are underreported of violence against minorities, especially in pockets that are dominated by Muslims. There have been attacks on Muslims. Also, there is violence in different forms, such as the beef ban. The beef ban is not just a ban on beef. The beef ban is actually a license for violence against minorities. There are at least there are several million people. My information is about 8 million people that consume beef, and the government is now dictating that they must not consume beef. And there is violence in the form of cow protection committees that have been formed by groups again affiliated to the BJP and the RSS that actually physically attack people that are suspected of either having consumed beef or transporting beef. And in my written testimony, I have shown pictures of people actually being hanged. So there are lynch mobs out to get people who are engaging in anything to do with beef. And so this is essentially part of the Hindu nationalist agenda also, to impose a homogenized upper caste Hindu culture on India.
Thank you. Mrs. Vandenberg, in your testimony, you state that despite no reported prosecutions for human traffickers in 2015, and even what you call credible reports of trafficking victims facing government prosecution, the U.S. State Department ranked India as a Tier 2 country in its 2015 TIP, the Trafficking in Persons report. You go on to recommend that India be ranked as a Tier 3 country. Could you explain in greater detail why you believe India should be ranked a Tier 3 country?
I'd be happy to. If you look at the criteria for rating, India hits the criteria for Tier 3 rating across the board. widespread corruption, widespread impunity, failure to investigate or register cases, failure to prosecute perpetrators, failure to prosecute corrupt officials, failure to provide data on prosecutions. Indeed, when I say no prosecutions, what I mean is that the Indian government has not provided any data whatsoever to the United States on prosecutions. Failure to protect victims from harassment, failure to provide consular services, prosecution of victims, detention of victims in locked facilities, which violates all best practices, failure to protect victims who've been trafficked by diplomats, failure to prevent or punish trafficking by diplomats, and even official willingness to circumvent international protections. I think that there are political reasons why India has been ranked highly, and I think that it would send a very strong message to India that the very volume, the enormous number of people held in forced and bonded labor in India, combined with the lack of resources that the Indian government has devoted to fighting this grave human rights violation, I think really places them in Tier 3.
Would you please elaborate on the incidents of human trafficking by Indian officials posted in the United States and the Indian government's response to these abuses?
I think that it is more than accurate to say that the Indian government has tolerated these abuses. Now, the cases that have ended up in federal court, we think, are the tip of the iceberg, because it's very difficult for human trafficking victims to find pro bono counsel, to find services, even here in the United States. So 3 cases in federal courts, I think, is an indicative of a larger problem. All 3 of those cases came out of the Indian consulate in New York. In one case, there was a criminal indictment for visa fraud and lying to federal officials. That was the Khobragade case, which got enormous publicity. The victim's family in the Khobragade case was harassed and was brought to the United States by the U.S. government for their own protection. But the other cases, which were federal civil cases, received far less media attention. One of them is Bhardwaj versus Dayal, and the second is Gurung versus Malhotra. The Malhotra case ended in a $1.4 million default judgment, after which the Indian government joined with the defendants to file a lawsuit against the victim and all of her pro bono lawyers, including the law firm of Gibson Dunn. Filed a lawsuit in India to prevent enforcement of the American judgment. The third case, the Dayal case, ended in an undisclosed settlement amount. Now, the test here is whether the Indian government actually tolerated this abuse, and our argument is that they have tolerated the abuse by, in each case, siding with the defendants, refusing to investigate. The State Department actually went to the government of India in 2013 with allegations that they had obtained concerning Khobragade. And rather than investigating the allegations, the Indian government took the move to try and transfer her to obtain full diplomatic status as a member of their mission to the United Nations. So there has been protection of officials rather than an investigation of officials.
In your experience, what support, if any, do non-governmental organizations engaged in anti-trafficking in India receive from federal, state, and local governments?
So I think it's fair to say, as others have said on this panel, that civil society and NGO communities in India are incredibly robust and do remarkable, remarkable work. And some of that work is funded by USAID, and some of it is funded by US foundations. I think there is a wide variability between the different states in India. Some states do show political will and provide funding. Other states do not. I think the federal government has shown, the federal government of India has shown really, in a sense, a tendency to deny that forced labor is an issue in India. So I would give the federal government very low marks on this. The state governments, I think, have a very variable rate of support from local non-government organizations.
Thank you. Mr. Charan Khandu, according to the most recent State Department Human Rights Report, quote, many scheduled cast members continue to face impediments to the means of social advancement, including education, jobs, access to justice, freedom of movement, and access to institutions and services," end quote. My question is, would you be able to explain or provide specific examples of what this sort of discrimination looks like at the individual level?
Thank you so much, Honorable Chairman. I'll be more than happy to answer this. I born in a teacher's family. My mom, elementary school teacher. My dad, high school teacher, first generation literate. My grandfather was a farmer. So we are educated, have money, but my mom is always posted in a Dalit village. So there is no one other than untouchables. And that is one socially discrimination. Even though I have money, we cannot have the same access what they have in the same village. Or if I go to a town, the moment I say that I'm an untouchable, or they figure it out. They'll ask my first name, last name, where are you, and all that. They do all that investigation, and they'll finally, we haven't got accommodation, even though we have money to pay. Social discrimination. And I'm number one in the school, even though I got first rank, but never, ever any encouragement, nothing. If that happens to someone else, other than an untouchable, there will be big celebration. The kind of discrimination I'm talking is basically affecting the mental discrimination, and after some time, not everybody is like me. I bounce back, but there are people who get suppressed. So there is a lot of self-esteem. They try to down your self-esteem so that you will never, ever think as a leader. So that is the biggest problem, even though we are here in USA. So, Rohit Vemala is a research scholar. He got admission by virtue of his talent. So he was so much humiliated by the government. Eventually he lost his, he committed suicide. So these are really, really bigger issues than the money. So this is the discrimination I've been facing, and I came to this country because I was working as a prestigious Baba Atomic Research Center as a scientist, and even though I'm outstanding, my promotions are rejected or delayed. So, like I said, I bounce back. I have, there is a country of opportunities. Why should I be here? I came here 20 years ago. I'm doing great. Still, I go every year and try to encourage our people. And the same thing I would like to attribute to the people with disability. In 2009, I started a foundation to help people with disability. The same thing what they have, you know, the self-esteem, this is not for me. I cannot do it. I cannot do it. So this kind of self-esteem, what I was trying to develop for these people with disability, I correlate to myself. Back in India, back in Dalit community, untouchable, you are untouchable, you are not fit, you born from the feet. All these things are in the mind. So they will never ever become a leader. What I see in this US education, we teach them the leaderships, how to be a good human, how to respect another human, but we don't respect any other human as a human being. So Dalit discrimination, caste discrimination is a human right. And when you don't teach another human as a human being, what are you? Thank you so much for the time you have given me.
Thank you. In your testimony, you cite a major increase reported by the Indian National Crime Bureau in crimes committed on the basis of caste over the past 5 years. How would you explain this increase in caste-based crime? And in your opinion, what are the most significant factors that contribute to the apparent persistence of the caste system in Hindu society, despite its abolition in the Indian Constitution?
Thank you so much, Chairman. So, like you said in the first question, a lot of scheduled caste people have got access to education and other jobs. That is because of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who came to this country some 100 years ago, who sacrificed his whole life for the reservations. As a result, all scheduled caste people got a chance to utilize the education, they got the jobs, and the next generation is even more smarter, and they are trying to exercise their powers. The moment you try to exercise your powers, then the retaliation by the government, you are untouchable. You are not supposed to be smart. You should stay there. And this is what one of the points what I mentioned in my testimony too. The moment you started accessing your rights, because you are a new generation and you have more intelligence, you have more awareness, and you have so much access to other social media and other electronics. The moment you do this, we will show you your place because you are acting smart. So this is increasing. The moment Rohit Vemula, a research scholar who got admission by virtue of his qualification, the moment he started about equality, freedom of religion, you don't like it. You cannot do that because your place is over there. Go to the manhole and remove all that human waste. That's your job. So that is the reason why it is increasing, because we cannot show our smartness. We have to be like this. That is going to increase further because I see a lot of gap from every 10 years. And now the young generation even more knowledgeable, even more aware of their rights. That means there will be more crimes. Thank you, sir.
Okay, for anyone who would like to respond, what role, if any, do you believe that Hindu nationalist organizations such as the RSS and its subsidiaries play in stoking tension between religious communities? And has the level of activity, the focus of these groups changed in recent years? And what kind of support do they have broadly in the country? Anyone who would like to respond? Yes, Mr. Tange.
So, as I've elaborated in my written testimony as well, Hindu nationalist organizations are at the forefront of fomenting sectarianism. One of the aspects of Hindu nationalism that has been sort of overlooked in how it is reported in the media is the practice of indoctrination. So, when the BJP came to power in 1998, it made certain that the heads of the government bodies that were actually putting together the curricula for the schools were headed by people that were ideologues of Hindutva, which is the Hindu supremacist ideology, and they went about their job of changing the school curriculums in a way that was aligned with their ideology. And the same practice is continuing even now, that the curricula in India are reflective of Hindutva. And they make absurd claims in textbooks such as, that the freedom struggle against India was actually a war against Muslims. One of the foundational or one of the core aspects of the Hindutva ideology is that Hinduism is the indigenous religion of India. Christianity and Islam are quote-unquote foreign religions, and therefore adherence to these religions cannot be treated equally, or their loyalty is somehow suspect. That same thinking is now creeping into school textbooks. So you have an entire generation of people actually growing up with this kind of an education. And the U.S. State Department's International Religious Freedom Report for 2002, 2003, and 2004 actually cited this kind of indoctrination as a threat to religious freedom. So that is one aspect of how Hindutva organizations are at the forefront of fomenting sectarianism and actually indoctrinating an entire generation of Indians towards sectarianism and hate.
Thank you very much. I haven't been watching the clock. We've run out of time. I will send follow-up statements or questions to you from myself and other members and ask you please respond. As we conclude today, I would like to thank all of our distinguished witnesses for their testimony, their courage in speaking out on these issues, and thank Mr. McGovern, the other members of commissions who have committed to addressing human rights concerns raised today. And I would like to take this opportunity to welcome the Prime Minister to our country, thank him for his commitment to advancing relations with the United States, urge him to take these considerations, these concerns into consideration. This commission has and will always be committed to advancing the cause of human rights wherever and whenever the need presents itself, and I look forward to working with all of our witnesses, all of you who have spoken today and spoken out on advancing the opportunities to address these concerns. With that, I thank all of those who attended, and this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you.